Thank you, Zinka. Thank you, those who came, and thank you those who are watching. And of course, great thanks to Professor Zvelutu, and thanks for hosting us and giving an opportunity to speak. I have to say this is my first trip to Africa at all, and I'm glad it started with Cape Town and your wonderful university. I'm glad to be here. So also apologies, I'm going to look into my phone because I have the text on my screen, and the main logic for it is like when you travel abroad and you take a long trip from Ukraine to South Africa, you appreciate every single gram of printed material and you don't want to waste paper on that. Anyway, so I do have my time now to briefly tell you about the main ideas from our document, which is now in the process. We're finishing it, but the idea of regional security and a couple of things that I would like to highlight from the document. So to begin with, I would like to say that, of course, you can always say that we Ukrainians are biased towards Russia because Russia invaded us, and we are traveling around the globe to get for more support, to get different countries to support us. But I would like to draw away from that position and say that now we have a great window of opportunity, because the war in Ukraine, of course, is a bloody war. It's unprecedented invasion by Russia. But what we have to look at is that now we have a window of opportunity to reform the world security architecture, which basically is crumbling. My colleagues yesterday used a very good metaphor, which is dying basically and not functionable. Because as we see, the architecture of international organization, which is heavily criticized, needs to be reformed in a couple of ways. So one thing is that we now have an opportunity to reform the United Nations Security Council, and that is also a great big deal for African continent. As we look at different ways this organization functions, we can see that the General Assembly, when doing any resolution on voting on things like aggression or invasion or stuff like that, we see that there is almost unanimous decision to that these things are not acceptable, especially with a country, as Dvinka mentioned, with nuclear weapons, invades its neighbor because it believes that its neighbor is not a country in itself, because we can all watch and rewatch Mr. Putin's interview to Tucker Carlson, where he spent a lot of time and great deal of time explaining why we Ukrainians do not exist. And then he decided to invade us because we don't exist in his nation, in his view. But the idea that we need to reform and change the security architecture is not the problem with General Assembly, but mostly with United Nations Security Council. Everybody, as a scholar of political science and international relations, we all know that we now kind of have to live, or we have to be squeezed into the framework of security architecture, which is a legacy of the Second World War. But at the very moment the United Nations was founded, and the world already back then was not as it used to be before. The great imperial powers of Europe were already crumbling. And my students, especially younger generation, they ask these questions. How come not a single African country is a permanent member of the Security Council? How come not a single Asian and Southeast country is there? Even though we know the big countries play an important role in the world politics, but they are not there. And great powers there can veto any decision. And I think this is exemplary that Russia blocks the decision of the Security Council, because the meaning, the symbolism of being on the Security Council is to provide for more security. But when a country which actually violates international world order and decides to invade a neighboring country sits there, it is an indicator, and also can veto any decision. It is an indicator there's something wrong with its system. Now, second thing, why is that we Ukrainians are interested in having more countries in the Security Council? Is that because we Ukrainians believe once we have, for example, South Africa there, you would definitely support us? It is not about that if we have more countries there, we Ukrainians might feel more support. The idea behind it is that if this organization or this structure, like General Assembly, is more diverse, has more voices from different continents, and these voices can also bring their own concerns for regional security in different contexts on different continents. We Ukrainians, and not only we, but all around the world, with a more diverse organization, with more countries there, I think there would be more opportunities to have a more secure and peaceful coexistence, or even of different systems, or different traditions and things. So it is extremely important, and I'm also advocating for this diversity diversity in this highly important international organization, because it can also bring more trust. So to tell you a funny story, last year I published my first non-fiction book, which is called Conspiracy Theories, How Not to Become a Conspiracist. It deals with conspiracies, conspirological worldview and all this stuff. And one of the examples, because this book is in Ukrainian for the Ukrainian audience, of course, and one of the examples is that there is a conspiracy in the United States which says that United Nations is taking over the United States to rule the states and the world. This conspiracy makes every single person in Ukraine laugh, because we don't see that the United Nations is so powerful, because it cannot prevent wars, it cannot stop genocides around the globe, and its Security Council is basically non-functioning because there are countries that can veto and block any decision. So it is very wrong, and something needs to be done about that. Again, with this diversity in Security Council, an opportunity to have more countries with their voices would also bring us Ukrainians an opportunity to be heard. This example of Russia annexing our territories, and just to give you this example, when Russia claims that the territories it annexed is part of Russia because there was a referendum, from the day of invasion to the decision to change the constitution to include these territories, it took 9 days. I think it is the swiftest way you can have it, from the day of invasion to have all the invasion, then announcing the referendum, and then making all the changes to constitution. Imagine how fast that could go, and what kind of referendum there might be. Imagine anyone, okay, and of course if you take pictures, you can look at the internet with military people with the guns walking on the streets with this funny box where you can cast your ballot. It is an example that this is not a referendum, this is not the will of the people. And I repeat this, if we could have a more diverse international security organizations where different countries had also their voice, their say, they bring their expertise, their problems and concerns, there would be a place for a fairer society and a fairer international community, which is very important to stress. Okay, so and yesterday I also thought about this idea of how we define regions and redefine regions, because we in Ukraine did not realize how important we were. For example, like average Ukrainian did not reflect that we were also important because of our grain and fertilizer export for the African continent. We realized that after the invasion. Of course, we know in Ukraine that we had a very developed and still have a very developed agriculture, but we did not reflect upon how important this global change. So regions now are transnational and global, so there is more connection to that. And to give you an example of where we have something to reflect upon together is this, the role of South Africa in non-proliferation, especially in terms of nuclear weapons, of course, because Russia now violated this principle by having its nukes in Belarus, a country it's practically occupied, and then this blackmailing the world with my colleague Olena is going to speak about the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe occupied by the Russian military. So the examples of creating world as a more secure place, and the role South Africa played in it, and like all this non-proliferation stories was developed. We have this experience that can be compared, studied, and when different regions, different countries, for example, East Europe, because Eastern Europe we have our own problems compared to Western Europe, and we have something really to reflect upon then. With this redefining the regional cooperation and regional security when learning from different experiences can also be a way forward with this. In our document, there's a whole section called multilateralism. I think that multilateralism really starts when, not only when great powers cooperate with each other, but when countries from Eastern Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia do find common ground to reflect upon the experience which is comparable, to find solution to create world a more safer space as such. I think I can stop there and then give the word to my colleague.